Hello and welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome Harold Holzer and his book Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. And we'd like to thank Citizen Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Company, for their continued support of Book Breaks. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend Leah, who will be answering your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, we are so happy to welcome our friend Harold Holzer, who serves as the Jonathan Fanton Director of the Roosevelt House of Public Policy at Hunter College in New York City. He is the author, co-author, or editor of 55 books on Lincoln and the Civil War era, and received the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize for Lincoln and the Power of the Press, the War for Public Opinion. Welcome, Harold. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you, Gina. Great to be with you on this beautiful New York day.
Yes. Well, hopefully it's beautiful wherever all our viewers are. And can you just start us off with an overview of this work?
Of course. This is a story about American immigration in the 19th century and Abraham Lincoln's particular reaction to it and influence on the issue. Why Lincoln? First, because he's the principal character of American history in the 19th century. So his attitudes are important. They're reflective of American attitudes. And as I mentioned, they also were influential on American attitudes. So he's a mirror, a useful mirror through which to see the changes in immigration policy over 50 years. But secondly, and most important, are the changes that he attempted to bring about as he was focused principally on slavery and restoring and preserving the Union. He also foresaw a multi-ethnic American future and did his best to ensure it. Even though, and this is a sort of a sidebar to the story, he occasionally flirted with the worst nativist forces in America in order to broaden his anti-slavery coalition. So I say at the outset of my book and all the talks that I've been doing across the country, it's a complicated story. American history is complicated, and not all of it is pleasant. Not all of it fits into the heroic mold. But who we are today is largely a result of Lincoln. A strong, united country. Even when we're divided politically, we're still a strong, united country. Second, a biracial country. And third, a multi-ethnic country. And that all goes back to Lincoln. I thought this was a piece that had not been explored, and that's why I undertook it.
Absolutely. Well, and you opened with Lincoln's 1864 message to Congress. What was significant about that speech?
63 and 64. I actually did both. Yeah. So it wasn't a speech in those days. It's the equivalent of the State of the Union address, but the tradition was it's delivered not as a speech, but as an actual piece of paper that the clerks read in the House and the Senate. So it's not as dramatic as the last few State of the Union addresses we've seen with all the anticipation. What was really dramatic about it is that in December 1863 and 64, Lincoln focuses a bit on immigration. And in December 63, right after delivering the Gettysburg Address, he comes back to Washington knowing this message was due. It's a deadline that he had to meet, but he was also really sick. He caught smallpox probably before he went to Gettysburg from his little boy, came down with it just hours after giving the Gettysburg Address, and was incapacitated for a couple of weeks at the White House, which is why, sadly, we don't have a manuscript copy of this speech. My guess is he either wrote so indecipherably that it had to be copied, or maybe he dictated part of it. At any rate, he comes up with a novel idea, and that is that with the ranks of the military dwindling because of death, injury, illness, desertion, expiration of service, and with many of the people returning to the domestic life not able to work anymore because of the injuries they sustained in the war, there was an acute manpower shortage on the home front and in the military. As Lincoln put it, in mines, factories, and farms. He was very specific. So Lincoln decided to call for the creation of the first Federal Immigration Bureau to expand the Immigration Landing Center in Lower Manhattan in New York City, which was called Castle Garden, where 70% of European immigrants landed. But also, most radically, really, and I didn't know this, I didn't focus on it, he asked for the federal government to pay for the passage of immigrants to get them here, those who could not afford passage. Can you imagine if that was proposed today? I mean, it didn't work then, but it was Lincoln's idea that it was worth replenishing American society with immigrants. Gina, can I make 2 points that are important?
Yes, please.
Excuse me. One is that to picture this moment, we have to keep in mind that the US Constitution had nothing in it about federal control of immigration. Naturalization, yes, but not immigration. That was left to individual states, Massachusetts, which had the port of Boston, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and New York, Georgia, with some of the Carolinas. Federal government didn't assume control until later with new legislation and with Supreme Court interpretation. So there were no walls, there was no ice, there was no razor wire, there was no border patrol. If you were coming here, and principally people came from Ireland and Germany in the beginning in the 1840s, you came to Castle Garden or a similar depot, you got off the ship, you registered your age, date of birth, country of origin. 5 years later, you could go back and apply for citizenship. That's all it took.
Wow.
And why is Lincoln still being dramatic when he proposes this? Because there was pushback, as there always is when second generation immigrants no longer are as eager for new immigrants to follow them. It's an American pattern, but we're an unusual country. We don't have a single nationality. We unite here because of an idea of democracy and economic opportunity. So there were people who pushed back against Catholics, and it got pretty vicious. But Lincoln's idea was, in 1863, to ramp up immigration. It had slowed down. Big in the 1840s, more than 1 million Germans and Irish. And then the Crimean War struck, and a lot of ships were waylaid to war service in Europe. Then the Civil War struck, and you have to be pretty either desperate or adventurous to come to a country at war to start a new life. So he was trying to stimulate it. And ultimately in 64, as you mentioned that message too, that's the message where Lincoln says that immigration is God's plan for the United States. He was increasingly talking about God's plan in the last 2 years of his life. God willed that the war continue. God instructed me that if we won the Battle of Antietam, the emancipation should be issued. I won re-election because of immigrants and God. So he now says immigration is assigned by providence, not Rhode Island, but God, to replenish our country. So by the end of his life, he really thought he was channeling divine will to expand the diversity in the population of America.
Yeah. What is Lincoln's own family immigration story?
His immigration story went way back to the 17th century, and I don't think he knew the full story. His ancestor, X number of times was an apprentice weaver named Samuel Linkhorn or Lincoln from England. They came to Massachusetts. They settled. They named their town after the town Hingham, Massachusetts, for Hingham, England. And eventually they left New England and headed south and west. I think the first Lincoln was really, our Lincoln was really certain about was his grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, the first Abraham Lincoln. And what he knew about him was that he was killed by American Indians on the frontier. Um, uh, 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 an attacking party that also aimed for the Abraham Lincoln, the first little boy Thomas, except that an older brother shot the Native American before he could kill Thomas. Otherwise, we would not have Lincoln, and book breaks would lose half of its historians, I think. So he did know that story, but he knew very little about his mother's side of the family, nor do we. In fact, that remains something of a mystery. Lincoln was not as interested in this subject as I am, or as I hope other people are. He once said he didn't really care what his grandfather was. He only cares about where his grandson will be. I'm sorry, I messed up Lincoln's punchline there, but he cares about the present and the future, decidedly.
I love that.
It gives me just kind of an inspiration or a moment to remark that Lincoln's generosity to European immigrants did not mean that he quite embraced total diversity in immigration. He signed an 1862 bill called the Cooley Act, which stamped out a lot of Asian immigration to California at the request of Republicans in California who were getting a little nervous. At one point, California was 61% foreign born. And it was actually couched as a progressive measure because this term coolie, which was a Chinese term, not an American term to insult Chinese immigrants, but the idea was that the coolie trade was not unlike the slave trade, and that something had to be done to keep indentured Asians from selling their lives in order to come to the United States. At least that was the excuse. And as for Latin American immigration, Lincoln really did not confront much of it, although he did support, crucially, at the end of the Mexican-American War, the idea that all Mexican citizens who lived in the territory that the United States acquired from the Mexican War could, at their own choice, become automatic American citizens without a waiting period. So he has a good story to tell on that side a little bit.
And is the Cooley Act connected with the building of the railroad?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's connected with, the railroad had mostly been almost completed. And so, but Chinese immigrants were also working in mines. They had been coming since the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. So it was a land of opportunity across the Pacific, but maybe a bridge too far for even those who were sympathetic to European immigration.
And was this the basis for the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Yeah, it certainly was a building block to that onerous act. Can't blame Lincoln for that one. That was Grant, right?
Right. And now, how did his fabled trips down the Mississippi affect his sort of later views on immigration?
Well, we know for sure that it affected him when it came to slavery because he saw a slave auction there. And his cousin, who recorded the first trip and also made recorded notes about the second trip, which is unusual because he didn't really go on the second trip. He kind of made it up. Never recorded Lincoln's reaction to being in the first cosmopolitan city he'd ever visited. I'm just surmising, and I think it's reasonable, that hearing French spoken on the streets and Spanish, seeing Creole people, just introduced him to a world he'd never seen, a different world of faces, different voices, different languages, and it alerted him to the fact that there was a world out there beyond the homogeneous prairie where he was living and where he'd been raised. So that was his first and really only visit to a cosmopolitan city in his life. He didn't, unless you count Chicago and New York and Boston in later years, Philadelphia and Baltimore. But that was his first experience, and I think it surely opened his eyes. And by that time, he had met. A little bit later, Irish people began coming into the community in the West, and then Germans.
Yeah, and one name that popped up in the book that I wasn't familiar with, who was fascinating, is William Florville. Can you tell us about him?
Yes, and he was a Haitian who had come through New Orleans, and he was, I mean, this is a relationship that you could say is unique in Lincoln's life before he met Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Um, Slavery was an issue. Enslaved people were an issue, but he didn't really know Black people. So he had no sense of their humanity until he had the opportunity to meet and befriend the very interesting William Florville, or William de Fleurville, which was his Haitian name. Kind of Illinoisized it when he got to Springfield. He was the local barber, and but he was more. He was the father of a free Black son who was captured in, I believe, New Orleans, and Lincoln represented him to get him liberated, reliberated. He was also an investor. He was a businessman, and Lincoln represented him in legal cases. And in a period where the humanity and the legal rights of free Black people was always open to question. Remember, in Illinois, Black suffrage had been rejected overwhelmingly for free Blacks in Illinois and in New York by white voters. He was I mean, were they social friends? No, but they were acquaintances, and I still, will be drawn from a book I wrote 30 years ago. You know, I did a book that you could never do today because nobody would want it. It was called Dear Mr. Lincoln, letters to Lincoln that had either been answered or unanswered. The reason one couldn't or wouldn't do it today is because these things are available on the internet now, if you search wisely enough. And in those days, there was no internet, so this was a new thing. Anyway, the only Springfield person who wrote to Abraham Lincoln as president, as far as I discovered, who did not ask for a job, money, or a favor, was William Florville. He wrote to say, I thought you might like to know that your home is looking good. He had rented it to someone, and your dog is doing well. Fido, dog he left behind. So he reported that to Lincoln and never asked for anything, just was giving an update. And then he thanked him for the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't usually get pleasant letters from home. By the way, as an aside, since Easter, although it was April 15th when in the year Lincoln was killed. Lincoln, of course, was memorialized on Easter Sunday in 1865, having been killed on Good Friday. But his dog Fido was also assassinated some years later. Some drunk stabbed Fido in the street. So
Oh, justice for Fido. Uh,
yes, we need a legal team.
yes. So something else that was fascinating in your book is that Lincoln, the way he utilized humor in dealing with topics regarding immigrants, most notably the Irish. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So even as Lincoln was defending immigration, and there were 4 or 5 points in his life, which maybe we'll go over in a subsequent question, but 1844, 1856, 59, and then we covered the Lincoln-Douglas debates as well. And you covered, Gina, in your first question, those annual messages where he actually called for specific legislative improvements in immigration policy. But he was very pleased with German immigrants, principally. Why? Because they tended to join anti-slavery political movements. They were well-educated, fleeing from failed democratic revolutions on the European continent, and they were anti-slavery. The Irish were attracted into the Democratic Party en masse. And the original resistance by Lincoln's party, the Whigs, to immigration made the Irish hostile to Lincoln's political home. So maybe that's an explanation for why Irish humor was always at the core uh, of his storytelling. They weren't terrible stories, and in fact, if you read them, no matter how you do them, they weren't terribly funny either. But um, to people who were raised on modern comedians who were pretty blunt, you know. But they sort of mocked the Irish for being slow-witted and drinking, but they were instructive stories, and Lincoln used them. He probably wouldn't have used them if the Irish were slightly more gettable for the Republicans. But he used them to good effect. When he didn't want to be directly involved with a decision, he would tell a story. So when General Grant and General Sherman asked him at the end of the Civil War, what shall we do with Jefferson Davis if we capture him? Lincoln sort of hinted that he would just rather they let him escape somewhere, to Mexico, to Cuba, wherever he was headed. And he said, he didn't say it directly. He said, that reminds me of a story of an Irishman who had taken the pledge not to drink. But he went to a picnic where the drinks were flowing. Someone came up to him, knowing his pledge, said, may I offer you, I'm not going to do the brogue, may I offer you a glass of lemonade? And the reformed alcoholic said, yes, and if I turn me back, and if you slip a little bit of the draft in there, unbeknownst to me, I'll still be okay. I still won't have abridged my pledge. Lincoln said, that's what I want to do with Davis. Let him escape unbeknownst to me. So that's the way he used humor. But it was always Irish humor because the Irish were political foes.
Yeah, and it's another sort of dramatic moment in the book that was fascinating is the Shields affair. Can you tell us about that?
Speaking of the Irish, James Shields,
Yes, segue.
yeah, good segue. James Shields was the Illinois state auditor in the 1840s. And he was an Irish immigrant. He had settled in Illinois, become a Democratic politician. And Mary Todd, the beautiful young Mary Todd, from whom Lincoln was now estranged, they had broken their engagement, began writing a pseudonymous series of satires about James Shields. Well, Lincoln wisely thought, if I get in on this satire business, maybe I'll win Mary back. So he began to help her and edit with her. Well, one of these Shields articles came out, signed Aunt Rebecca, which is a character they made up, and Shields was outraged. He demanded to know who the true author was. Lincoln gave his name up, and Shields challenged him to a duel. They went off to an island on the Mississippi, now gone, alas, on the Missouri side where dueling was legal, and they almost had a fight to the death. Lincoln had the choice of weapons, so he chose broadswords, which are really long swords, and then he practiced by shearing off branches from low-hanging trees to show his strength. And that's when Shields said, well, maybe we should just forget the whole thing. Lincoln regarded this as the most embarrassing episode of his life, and he never talked about it, but it impressed Mary. She married him. Skip ahead to almost 20 years. In 1861, and we haven't touched on this yet, but in 1861, Lincoln decided to recruit heavily in ethnic communities. He wanted Irish volunteers, he wanted German volunteers, and he wanted poster boys from each ethnicity to inspire recruitment. And the Archbishop of New York recommended with Lincoln 3 must-gets for this list. And the third was Shields. And Lincoln swallowed his pride, forgot his past, and asked Shields to serve as a major general. And Shields came all the way from the West Coast and did serve briefly in the military. I mean, he was a Mexican War hero by then, and he was a bust as a general. But Lincoln didn't recruit these ethnic generals because he hoped they would be successful, but when they weren't, they still served a really important purpose, which was to inspire others of their ethnic group to enlist.
Yeah, and did these soldiers help evolve Lincoln's views on immigration or shift it?
That's a great question. I think I think they did. I think he became to admire the Irish volunteers. It all began in New York at a rally in Union Square in April 1861, when Irish speaker after Irish speaker stood up and said, "We didn't vote for Lincoln, but that's our flag." And they pointed to the actual Fort Sumter flag, which was on display atop the statue of George Washington that still stands in Union Square Park. As long as we can keep it there, it's been, one of those statues that's in constant, under constant challenge. That's our flag, and the attack on it at Fort Sumter was as bad as if the English fleet had sailed into New York Harbor. So, yeah, it changed Lincoln's mind. I mean, he still didn't have political friends among the Irish, but he had Michael Corcoran of New York, who was being court-martialed for not assembling the 69th Regiment to welcome the Prince of Wales to New York City. When he recruited the 69th to go to war, they forgot about the court-martial. Thomas Francis Marr, who had been sent by the British to Australia as a prisoner and escaped. He was second in command of the 69th and was raising Irish regiments for almost the entire Civil War. Corcoran was captured at Bull Run, actually. And then on the German side, Franz Sigel and Karl Schurz and generals with great colorful names like Alexander Schimmelpfennig were, again, poster boys for German recruitment. By the end of the war, there were almost 200,000 German soldiers fighting for the Union and about 150 to 60,000 Irish, not Irish and German by descent, people born in Germany and Ireland, either naturalized citizens or even those awaiting citizenship. So the Union Army was a foreign legion in many ways, and that was because of Lincoln's encouragement of immigration and participation by immigrants in a war to save their adopted country. The South had attracted many fewer immigrants over the decades, for good reason. There was limited opportunity for newcomers there because of the slave system, and immigrants instinctively knew that, and they set sail for places where they could enter the workforce in whatever low-level job was required and open. And that's why there was such an abundance of manpower in the North at the start of the war, because the system was more attractive to newcomers.
Yeah, I mean, you've written so extensively about Lincoln. I was wondering, in your research for this book, what surprising discoveries you made. Is there anything, you had any aha moments?
Well, the depth of the reform movement with paying for immigration was an aha moment, because Lincoln's speech said we have to support it. Going back into the congressional hearings and the newspapers, and he's seeing the vicious reaction by the Democratic members of Congress and by Republican papers as well. This will bring the dregs of Europe, the criminals, the insane. Does it all sound familiar? It should, because it's the same specious arguments that have always been used to deter or to discourage immigration or to resent immigrants. So the fact that history repeats itself surprised me to that degree, or at least that history in the Lincoln era anticipated the never-ending struggle between migrants and refugees and established populations and those who did not want diversity. And I guess Lincoln's a boldness in speaking out during the Lincoln-Douglas debates on immigration was affirmed what I thought was his good public record. Even though he was trying to get nativists to join the anti-slavery cause, he thought that they would drop nativism at some point. Some did, some didn't.
Yeah, and before I pass you over to Leah and questions from the chat, just wondering what you think the lasting legacies of Lincoln's view on immigration are and the current political landscape, if there are any. Well,
I don't like to be political. I like to be historical.
Right. Okay.
But one moment in the story is just so universal, so timeless and so timely that I've been quoting it all over the country as I travel. Um, and this took place on July 11th, 1858. It wasn't the Lincoln-Douglas debate. It was right before the formal debates started taking place in Illinois. Douglas had spoken the night before. Lincoln was responding, and he looked out in the crowd, and there were immigrants, people he knew, Scandinavians, Germans, and Irish in the crowd. And he said, we're here because it's Independence Day period. We're here to celebrate the founders. We're here to celebrate their direct descendants because they made this democracy. But I see among you people who are not part of that generation, who came from other countries. And I want you to know that the Declaration of Independence assures that you are the equal of any of those founders or descendants, because you, as they, are the blood of the founding generation. So at this moment, where he could have been for a white Anglo-Saxon only America, Lincoln said that immigrants were enriching the blood of America, not poisoning the blood of America. And it was at as fractious and divisive a time as we have now. And I think that's a quote we should remember. You are the blood of the founders. That's the electric cord in the Declaration of Independence that unites us.
Wow, that's amazing. Such a great quote for teachers that we have online as well today. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to Leah, who's going to start with our student scholar question of the week.
Thank
Take
you,
it away.
Jean.
Yes, thank you, Gina and Professor, for such an interesting start of the discussion. I really enjoyed it. And I'd like to begin first by focusing our attention to the History Scholar of the Week. And so the History Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guest a question, and they can win themselves and their teacher a $50 gift card for their Goodwill Letterman gift shop. And so the History Scholar of the Week today is Charlotte, who I think is watching us right now. And her question is quite similar to the discussion you've just been having with Gina. And she was asking about what are the similarities or differences between Lincoln's era and today's immigration debates that you find personally the most interesting?
Well, it's a broader question than I just answered, so I'm grateful for it. And congratulations, Charlotte. I hope you use the gift certificate to get the book. We'll get it to you one way or the other. Well, the similarities are chilling in a way because, the more things change, the more they stay the same, despite the fact that we say that we need to learn from history and that history repeats itself or at least echoes in many ways. We still argue about who, quote, belongs in this country, who has a right to migrate, who has a right to refugee status when they are oppressed in all parts of the world. We've settled it several times in our history with Lincoln's reforms. But between 1865, when his last bill became law, there was not another pro-immigration law until 1965. Everything between had been restrictions, quotas, keeping people out of America. And now we're in this really astonishing kind of limbo with dreamers and DACA students and people who had, been here for their entire lives, not knowing what their status is, and with their critics and their doubters not really understanding the history, the contested history of immigration, which I think Lincoln demonstrated would be beneficial to the broader country by having more people, more diversity. Now, the difference, I suppose, is that, well, one difference is that race is a factor now, and that does tend to sometimes bring out the worst in some Americans. Second reason is that when Lincoln called for replenishment of mines and farms and factories, we had a lot of open space and too few people. And you can make the case now that we have 10 times as many people as we did in the beginning of the Civil War. and not much more territory. What have we added? Just a few western states and Texas and Alaska and Hawaii. But we still have jobs open to people. And you hear the mantra now that you heard then is that these are jobs that people who've been in America for several generations do not and want to and will not do. And yet people who come to America from overseas or over rivers want desperately to work. They don't want to smuggle or hurt. Preponderantly, they want to work and enter society and be part of the American dream. So the geography has changed. The cities have gotten more crowded. But in my view, again, not to be political, but Lincoln said we cannot escape history, and we shouldn't try. The need is still there. And the American promise is supposedly not changed. And that's opportunity for anyone who wants to work here.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for
Thanks,
those wise words. And our next question is from Sam, and he asks, when many of the anti-immigrant proponents in the Know Nothing Party began to join the Republican Party, how did Lincoln negotiate relationships with them?
Well, that's a great question. The Know Nothing movement mushroomed in the 1850s, and that was a group of clubs, actually, in the beginning, that held secret meetings to think of ways to discourage or menace Catholic immigrants. Lincoln was never a member of that movement, nor did he condemn its members, because he felt that many of them would eventually be willing to join coalitions committed to restricting slavery into the West. So he writes to people things like, I will fuse with anyone as long as I have the right to create the conditions under which fusion will take place. But the Know Nothing movement, he says in 1855, is not entirely crushed to pieces, and we need to pick up the remnants when it's fragmented. So all the way through his Senate election in 1858, he is flirting with former members of what morphed into something called the American Party, which was a national third party movement. In the presidential election of 1856, the Know Nothings got 22% of the popular vote. That's 15 points more than a third party candidate is polling in the public opinion polls today. It was a lot. And he wanted them to be anti-slavery. So eventually, many of the leaders of the movement are absorbed into the Republican Party with no more questions asked. Whether that was wise or unwise, Lincoln's greater good argument is that the Union needs to be preserved and slavery needs to be curtailed. But the original founders and philosophers of nativism had died off. I'll give you one example, which was a surprise to me. Gina was asking about surprises. Samuel Morse, whom we know principally as the inventor of the telegraph or as an American portrait artist, was a venomous anti-Catholic writer in the 1830s, writing these and publishing these screeds, warning that if Catholics came in continued large numbers, that the Pope was going to take over the United States and priests were going to supplant public officials, and all these dire, crazy warnings that people sadly took seriously. So Lincoln was not a know-nothing, but he did not condemn them outright in order to get them. Lincoln was nothing if not a shrewd political operator.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it. And our next question is from Carol, and she asks, as far as you know from your research, was Lincoln open to embracing all immigrants, regardless of ethnicity or country of origin, that they would arrive to the U.S. from?
As I said earlier, he was willing to sign an act limiting some Chinese immigration to the West Coast, but he also accepted the first wave of Latin immigration after the Mexican War. It would have been interesting to see how Lincoln would have confronted Southern European immigration. I mean, there was some Italian and Hungarian immigration during the Civil War. We know that because they joined the Union Army. There was a Hungarian unit called the Garibaldi Guard, named for an Italian, that came out of New York City in 1861. He was friendly enough with Jewish immigrants and whatever their country of origin. And so one would like to think that as the immigration pool became more and more diverse, Lincoln would have instinctively supported the idea, because again, he was for building employment base, population base, and growing freedom westward. As he said, he wanted free people to occupy the West. He once said he wanted Hans and Baptiste and Patrick. That was his cute, informal way of saying the Germans, the French, and the Irish. Did he add people of color to that group? Not at this point, because slavery had become a domestic institution, and the future of African Americans was a separate issue for Lincoln and would be dealt with. Of course, he was cut down too soon and didn't get to deal with it. But he didn't regard free African Americans as immigrants. He regarded them as Americans at that point, not citizens yet, but on the edge of citizenship.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is from Steve, and he asks, to what extent was there a connection between the Homestead Act of 1862 and Lincoln's plan to increase immigration?
That's a good question, and it is covered in the book. And there is an irony in the Homestead Act piece of the book and of history that I also acknowledge, and this is an opportunity to acknowledge it again, because again, the story is complicated. For example, and I'm not dodging the Homestead, I'll get to it in a second. There were people in the early part of the 19th century, as the international slave trade is heading to its constitutionally mandated conclusion, that oppose immigration, but don't see anything wrong with the forced immigration of Africans. It's like two different things that they don't have to deal with together as a single sentiment. By the same token, and here we get to the Homestead Act, Lincoln makes sure in his various immigration reform initiatives of the 1860s that the same free land opportunities that are available to Americans are available to immigrants. Even before they qualify for citizenship, they can take free homestead land under the same terms as are available to American citizens, that if they work it and improve it for a certain amount of time, they get the legal title to the land. And that was like paying for passage to America itself, was a really radical reform gesture. Another irony is that, and I acknowledge this in the book, is that Lincoln did not see the irony, for want of a better word, of the fact that most of these lands had been occupied by indigenous people who had been moved off the land through government policy. So Lincoln did believe in the removal and containment of indigenous people and was supportive of giving their former lands to European immigrants. That's why I said the story is deeply complicated. And I'm not here to celebrate Lincoln's immigration policy. I thought my responsibility was to illuminate it, elaborate on it, but to also address the complications that make it far from perfect.
Thank you again for that question. And the next question is it's from Matthew, and he's wondering whether you have any comments or insights upon Lincoln's relationship with Germans in the Illinois and Missouri area, particularly with his friendship with Gustav Kerner.
Sure. So with the growing influx of Germans to the West after 1848 into the 1850s, Lincoln found kindred spirits on anti-slavery. These Germans were passionately anti-slavery, and Lincoln wanted them to be part of the Republican Party. And on Washington's birthday, 1856, Lincoln is the only politician in the midst of a really brutal snowstorm to attend an 1856 Republican Editors Convention in Decatur, Illinois. And there, the editor of a German language newspaper from Chicago named George Schneider, Lincoln even knows that his name means tailor in English. That's about as far as he's gotten in his German lessons, but he knows one word anyway. Schneider wants a plank in this new state platform, in the organizing platform, that says that immigration should remain open. And Lincoln is the person who undertakes to write a plank in the platform that satisfies the pro-immigrant people and some of the people who are on the fence, and especially satisfies the Germans. Gustav Kerner is one of the earlier generation of German immigrants. So Lincoln has known him for a long time. He was lieutenant governor of Illinois. He was the go-to German politician in Illinois for many years. In 1858, when Lincoln accepted the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate to run against Stephen Douglas, Kerner was in the chairman's seat for the House Divided Address, which was Lincoln's speech accepting the nomination for the Senate. The only problems that finally divide them come in 1861 when Lincoln is elected president. And Kerner, who has spoken throughout the campaign in Lincoln's behalf in an age when presidential candidates did not campaign for themselves, Kerner's given speeches in German and English throughout the West, and he wants a government job. And Lincoln does not want to give him one because he doesn't want to give another Illinois person a big government position, feeling that he, Lincoln, represents Illinois. So Kerner is very frustrated and unhappy. Then he wants to raise a regiment, and Lincoln kind of complains to him that he's waited too long and he's embarrassing him by asking to raise more men when there are no more men to be supplied. Eventually, Kerner does join the Federal Army and becomes valuable to Lincoln. Cut to other states, we have Carl Schurz from Wisconsin, who also campaigns for Lincoln, and he becomes minister to Spain, which is like ambassador. And then when Kerner returns from Madrid to join the army himself, our friend Gustav Kerner takes Schurz's place in Madrid. He finally gets to be an ambassador, although he too comes back before his term is ended because he wants to join the war effort. In Missouri, which is a state divided between pro and anti-slavery forces, Lincoln has a lot of trouble throughout the war. He uses, he relies on Franz Sigel, another one of those German officers who is not great in the field, but is a magnet for recruitment, to be a symbol of Union loyalty in Missouri. But in 1864, Lincoln has to confront a third-party movement against him because he's insulted Sigel by demoting him, because he has insulted John Fremont by demoting him. He's a favorite of the Germans, and it very nearly cost him the election. But he finally wins out, and the third-party challenge is dropped. But for a while, it's very touch and go with Germans. They want emancipation to extend even to the border states like Missouri, which it doesn't originally. So Lincoln pledges to a 13th Amendment ending slavery anywhere. Anyway, that's a very long question, but it's a very long answer, but it's a really deep question that can go in a lot of different directions. So the short answer is the Germans were crucial to Lincoln's political success. They got a lot of federal patronage for their effort. They almost turned on him for re-election, but they came back to the fold. You know, Lincoln was, he died in a house owned by a German immigrant. He His assassin was killed by a British immigrant who was under the command of an Irish immigrant captain. He was attended on his deathbed, Lincoln was, by a Latvian immigrant ophthalmologist. The hanging of the conspirators was supervised by a German and photographed by a Scottish immigrant. And when Lincoln's body lay in state in New York, an Irish general stood at the head of the coffin, and a German chorus sang from Wagner operas down on the ground floor of City Hall. So again, it was a country that spoke, not only an army, but a country that spoke with a foreign accent, and much of it was German.
That was a great answer. Thank you for elaborating on that. Really interesting. The next question is from Jeff, and he asks, American immigration has been steeped in fear of the transmission of contagious disease. And since many states, most notably New York, as it had the quarantine islands of Hoffman and Swinburne, who are financially responsible for medical screening, did Lincoln ever deal with issues concerning that?
That's a really good question. And Lincoln, the issue had come up in the early days of immigration in the 1840s, when the states had the police power to impose their own controls over immigrants and to some degree immigration. And the way they impacted on immigration was first to pass restrictions on the weight of ships, which they assumed that human cargo would be the first cargo limited, not precious goods that could be sold. So they thought that restrictions on weight would help. When that didn't help much, they imposed very often a $1 head tax. And that was a big bone of contention in the 1840s and 50s. What the $1 head tax was meant to do, I think, was to discourage totally impoverished people who would be on the public dole from coming to the United States. But what the money was specifically allocated for was the care of people who were ill or indigent. So that's the early acknowledgement that there could be health problems. But because there was so little understanding of contagious disease at this point, beyond, smallpox and the yellow fever, whose origins they weren't sure about, but which they knew spread, there wasn't, except for the general thought that impoverished people had diseases that could spread, it wasn't a Lincoln concern. Because again, able-bodied, meaning was ostensibly and hopefully people who were well, they were the people that Lincoln needed to populate the farms, the mines, the factories, the Army, and the Navy.
Okay, yeah, great answer. And then this is a question that you've kind of already been sharing, but it's asking if you could share any anecdotes or insights from Lincoln's personal correspondence or speeches that particularly resonated with you regarding this topic of immigration. So like you've shared.
So I talked about one, the blood of the blood speech. I talked about the Hans and Baptiste speech. I talked about the resolution he wrote in 1856. He wrote another letter of support for not changing the residency laws for voting rights in 1859. But I think one of the most interesting ones was 1861. As president-elect, he was on a long, slow train trip to Washington, D.C. from Springfield, which crisscrossed through some major cities in the North, and at one point found him in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was a town filled with German immigrants. And they marched to his hotel and demanded that he come out and see them, and he did. And he addressed them informally, but he said, when I look at you, and they expressed loyalty, they wanted to fight for the country even before the Civil War had started. He said, I would put aught, meaning nothing, A-U-G-H-T, aught in the way of anyone coming from overseas and starting a new life here. It's just my inclination and my belief that everyone belongs and everyone should have the right to an equal chance in what he called the race of life. So I like the Cincinnati speech as well. You know, by and large, Lincoln stopped making public speeches after his inaugural address. We think of him as a great orator, but except for the Gettysburg Address and very few other major utterances, he did not speak publicly. Presidents were not supposed to address the public or tweet or do Instagram or any of that. I don't think Lincoln would have tweeted, but we don't know. So those are my favorite immigrant and immigration remarks of Lincoln's, and most of them are leading up to his presidency.
Oh, that's great. And that was actually kind of connected to another question, which was how specifically did his speaking out about immigrants change while he was president?
Well, there's a difference between what he said in Cincinnati, I would place nothing in the way of immigration, than what he said in 1863 and 64, which is I want an act to encourage immigration. One is I accept it if it happens, and the other is I want to stimulate it. I want to use the power of government. I want to use the power of government to improve landing stations, to create a bureau, to help people find work, and in his ideal way, to pay for immigration. So I think those statements, even though one was written, the last one was written and not read aloud, reflected a big change in rhetoric. And then the final one is to say that God had ordained it. That's, just as God had ordained the end of slavery and the war, was a major concession by Lincoln to the righteousness of immigration.
Okay, great. And this is a question from Carol again, and she's asking if maybe you could share any more of Lincoln's jokes or observations. She says that her favorite is the joke about the Gordian knot.
Well, the other jokes about immigration, I mean, then the Irishman, somebody said, why were you not born in the United States? And he says, well, my mother couldn't help it or something. They're all, nothing but a noise. If an Irishman is scared, they're kind of lame by today's standards. But, we have to imagine Lincoln doing accents while he gave jokes, which is not PC anymore. So I don't do accents when I relate them. But I'm not sure the humor works anymore, but the inclination is to tease a group that is not a natural supporter of him. And I think that's an interesting way that he goes about targeting in a gentle way his opponents. He kind of insinuates that they're not well schooled enough, they're not sober enough to understand the attractiveness of his political movement.
That's great. That was the last question. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thanks for moderating, Leah.
Yes, thank you so much today. It was such a fantastic session. And if you didn't get a chance to get your question answered, a great remedy for that is to purchase Brought Forth on This Continent right now at bookshop.org. And the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And plus, it's a great read. And next week, we hope you'll join us when we welcome the author of The Abolitionist Civil War, Immedius, and the Struggle to Transform the Union. So sort of continuing our theme of 19th century history. And you can also watch our archive of more than 175 scholar presentations, including this one, on book breaks at gilderlehrman.org/bookbreaks. And our website, you can also find documents, essays, digital exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, Summer PD, and so much more. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation.